Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another the working of miracles. To another prophecy. To another the discernment of spirits. To another various kinds of tongues, and to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. On this occasion, we celebrate the life of one gifted with prophetic vision, gifted with prophetic action. We celebrate the life and legacy of one bestowed with gifts of the Spirit unlike those we have witnessed before. We celebrate the life and legacy of one who, not unlike the prophet John the Baptist, cried out against racial injustice in the wilderness of a racist society, and who heard the voice and had a vision of God. We gather this morning in this frigid cold, warmed by a memory of one who this day casts a benign shadow over this nation and causes a shiver of hope, even in the midst of darkness, to pass through us. Even as we inaugurate one who seeks to compromise our freedoms. Even a memory of one who did not live to see his normal span of life as it yielded to an assassin's bullet. Yet this whole land is affected so deeply and completely. People of diverse backgrounds come together and during this time to celebrate this life. We celebrate the life of one who did not come of a majority of people, but who came of the loins of a disinherited and disallowed people. One who was the seed of enslaved people and who tasted the bitter cup of oppression. Yet even so, from one end of the country to another this week, even across the globe, we will remember one about whom the Nathaniels of his time have wondered, can anything good come out of Nazareth? The skeptics of history must have asked, can anything good come from this son of the South, this country bumpkin, this poor preacher endowed with ebony skin? And yet the world is now gathering to remember today and pay homage to Martin Luther King, Jr. And this nation has paused for a brief moment to be warmed and to be warned by his memory and lighted in the midst of a dark time by a hope. 56 springs have come and gone, and yet the shadow of this prophet looms larger than ever in this climate crippled by injustice. For here was a life of such broad grandeur, such passion, such commitment, commitment and such dedication to humanity that we are still trying to fully understand the full impact of the gift, the grace, and the life of this magnificent human being. Even though in this century we still are unable to grasp the true meaning of his life, we do understand this. We understand that this life has affected each of us and has affected this land indelibly and irrevocably. The glow of the life of Martin Luther King Jr. will not go out, and its impact will not lessen, and its force will not dim. And so as I seek to set this life in the proper context and to somehow exploit the brilliance of its existence, and as I have likewise known the fruits of its labor and have tasted of their promise, and as I now relax on the foundation laid by those who now take their rest, I cannot help but to wonder what has become of the dream. As the 57th anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination approaches and people across the country seek to celebrate his memory, it is a key time to reflect on what King's legacy was and wasn't, and what it might look like to really honor him today. How are we honoring the dream? Time and time again, educators and activists, including King's daughter Bernice, have pointed to how King's words have been whitewashed and mischaracterized over time, with children taught a sanitized version of King's activism in schools, contributing to a deliberately distorted view of the civil rights leader as more of a pacifist, less of a radical than he was. People often quote King preaching about love. His famed "hate cannot drive out hate" quote is all over Instagram, while they less often cite his more anti-establishment statements, such as his calling out the white moderate in his letter from a Birmingham jail. Each year on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, politicians post all over social media honoring Dr. King, all the while pushing policies like voter restrictions that disenfranchise people of color. Meanwhile, those who in this time had dared to stand up to injustice, those from kneeling NFL players to Black Lives Matter protesters to Palestinian people who are no longer comfortable wearing the yoke of oppression, they're often vilified for being too extreme, much like King was in his day. There was a very interesting article I read some years ago that I want to share with you this morning. Dr. Earl Fisher wrote a commentary in the New Tri-State Defender a few years ago titled "Day of Service, a Superficial Sham of a Way to Celebrate ML King Day." And he writes in the context of Memphis, because that's where he was, but mentions Martin Luther King Day in Memphis, and the nation has become a shame. What has become superficial, he says, is the spirit and purpose of the day of service. So I want to read some of his article to you. He writes, and I quote, "Dr. King Day became a federal holiday in 1983. 11 years later, in 1994, Congress designated the day as a National Day of Service. In 2020, the Day of Service has become a sham. It has been a sham for several years now. The modern MLK Day is used as a day where people evoke Dr. King's name who do not share Dr. King's nature.
Right.
People who work against the initiatives King fought for, chastise citizens, subversively blaming victims for the social conditions, and challenge them to engage in charitable acts instead of advocating for justice. He says, I recently listened to an interview Dr. King gave to NBC News in 1967, and he confessed that the dream he shared at the March on Washington in 1963 had at many points turned into a nightmare. Dr. King felt he was guilty of, as James Baldwin coined it, integrating my people into a burning house. We don't ever hear that quote from Dr. King in mid-January or ever really. Dr. King would go on to suggest that his optimism was a bit superficial and must be tempered with solid realism. And here's the real. As he talks about his own experience in Memphis, he says, Memphis is unwilling to highlight the critical claims King made regarding social change. Hardly any of our social, political, or religious leaders talk about our need for radical transformation, and those that do are demonized and vilified. We are prodded to pick up more trash, pray for those in poverty, and take a child to the Grizzlies game. Does anyone care that while we are bragging about billion-dollar projects in downtown, Midtown, and Harbortown, poverty is increasing in Boxtown and South Memphis and North Memphis? We have money for bridge lights, banquets, and banners, but we can't seem to find money for Black lives. MLK Day makes me think about what we're doing pragmatically rather for everyday people. People like one of my new parishioners, he said, let's call him Greg. I met Greg while he was in jail facing an armed robbery charge. He was about 25 years old at the time. He was just beyond the scope of those we now refer to as opportunity youth. In other words, he was just old enough to be left behind by the current thrust of momentum we have in the city. Greg's life won't be transformed through 100 more hours of community service or baptism into volunteerism. His quality of life won't improve through pious prayers that are disconnected from progressive public policy. What Greg needs is a restructuring of the social conditions. He needs access to a livable wage job. He needs health care. He needs a community that will spend more on his education than we spend on his incarceration. Community service only requires a sacrifice of our time. And when you are white, rich, or privileged, time is usually on your side. Time is not on Greg's side. In fact, Greg is trying to reconfigure his life to make up for time he's lost. He goes on to say, Black folks in Memphis are working against the clock. We need people willing to sacrifice their treasure, money made on the backs of Black labor, more than we need tutors to help kids in schools we refuse to support with city tax dollars. Calls for service in an inequitable environment are concoctions of deception and disrespectful to Dr. King's transcendent legacy. Service is cosmetic. Equity is structural. What if MLK Day became the day where elected officials, clergy, and community advocates presented progressive policy proposals to the public in Dr. King's honor? Sign me up for that program. When King began to advocate for a redistribution of wealth and the revolution of values, he was targeted more aggressively and killed in Memphis. But maybe that's the plan after all. Keep us all chasing a dream, serving, waiting on justice until we die. As the country honors King's life, cut too short on April 4th, 1968, I want to explore just for a few moments, beloved, how people can really do justice to King's legacy now. More than post on social media, more than recite I have a dream, more than deal in a sanitized and acceptable version of a revolutionary king, more than a day off, more than coming to a service of commemoration. If we really care about the legacy of Dr. King, the question before us all today is, how are we honoring that legacy today? How are we making his dream a reality in the 21st century? And might I suggest that there are at least 5 things we can do, and then I'm going to sit down. My goal today is to make those comfortable with the sound bites and rhetoric uncomfortable. Number 1, don't whitewash King's words.
Right.
Don't whitewash King's words. Warrior Reed, who marched with King in the 1963 March on Washington, he said, I think we have done a very poor job of honoring King's legacy. In fact, it has been seriously mischaracterized. One of the things they teach to the children is King is a man of peace. And I've heard him speak or preach 35 to 40 times. He only mentioned peace once. He did not advocate for peace, but for justice. He used to advocate that until there was justice, there would be no peace. Our history books lionize Dr. King as a visionary leader, but in the 1960s, he was a publicly labeled terrorist by those in power. Things are not different today with the current generation of civil rights visionaries. Dr. King knew that he would sacrifice everything, including his life, for the liberation of black people from the system of white supremacy. Yet today, many remember him only as a vision of black children and white children playing side by side and nothing more. The radical of Dr. King is less comfortable and less conforming to popular ideas about leadership in the ongoing black liberation movement. Just like Birmingham's fire hoses wouldn't stop King, and those who marched alongside him, attempts to water down King's radical roots must be refuted. Number 2, we can fight poverty and economic injustice. When Dr. King was killed in Memphis, he was there to help sanitation workers protest the fact they weren't getting equal pay. What would he be doing here now? He would be pointing out that the poverty rate is higher now than when he gave his life for it. What he was working on was the Poor People's Campaign. His goal was to go to Washington and to close it down, demanding that the government respond substantively to the scourge of poverty in this rich country. A lot of the reasons he was assassinated were his critique of capitalism and militarism and racism. Those intersections are at the core of the American empire today. Endless wars and occupations, how much money is going to militarizing police, how black folks still crying about violence are getting no resources. His legacy is very relevant in terms of the types of conversations we have, the type that we have to be having about racism and capitalism and militarism and how we move forward. Number 3, doesn't matter how old you are, you got to step off the sidelines and take action. Especially if you consider yourself white. King started speaking a lot about how it's liberal whites who are the problem. We know how racist folks stand, but it's individuals on the fence who think the issues don't affect them and pick and choose what they want to tackle. And he was getting really frustrated with those individuals who would keep the status quo going by not fully standing up and engaging against something. The work is not glamorous. It requires great sacrifice. It's easy for many to say they would have marched against segregation in the 60s, but many have not seen today's marches against the unjust killing of black people as for them.
Yes.
In addition, there's a performative activism. There's a performative activism that has emerged in the last years. It became a fad to be considered an activist, like I'm taking pictures in front of a march, I'm taking selfies with these folks who are marching. That does not live up to King's legacy. King was dangerous. King was dangerous in part because of his ability to call to our attention the evils of society and to shine a light on those who were standing on the sideline. We are called to get off the sideline. King told us why we couldn't wait, and our job today is to wake people up to the fact that we still can't wait. Today, in this very fragile democracy, we must work to bring about justice as we are invited into a radical vision, as imagined and as implemented by thousands of black youth in this nation. A vision that shifts power away from white supremacists and away from the stall tactics of moderates. Justice cannot wait. So pay attention to social issues. Find one that troubles you and start working to eliminate it. Don't ignore the issues of today's world that make you uncomfortable. Let them trouble you.
Yes.
Let your soul be bothered by the weight of injustice. Embrace sympathy, but even more so than that, be moved to action. Awareness breeds action, and action results in change. Martin Niemöller was a prominent Lutheran pastor in Germany, late 19th and 20th century, and early 20th century. He emerged as an outspoken foe of Adolf Hitler and spent the last 7 years of Nazi rule in a concentration camp. He is perhaps best remembered for his post-war words. He said, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Justice needs an advocate. And so the question for us today is, how are we supporting the dream? Number 4, lead by example. Lead by example. Though far from perfect, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led by example. He didn't tell others to march while he stayed home. He marched with them, showing others the beauty of nonviolent protest, and we can do the same. At home, at school, at work, at the park, in the city, in the suburbs, wherever you are, there's an opportunity to follow the crowd or lead by example. Lead. Let your principles guide you, even when they are unpopular, even when the road seems long, tough, and dreary, even if persecuted. Lead by example. As Dr. King says, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. The true neighbor will risk his position, his prestige, and even his life for the welfare of others. Number 5, and perhaps the most important, have faith. Have faith. Anyone familiar with Dr. King's legacy knows he had many, many days filled with doubt.
Yes.
He was hopeful but unsure, prayerful and yet sometimes discouraged. And this too is our story, no matter the battles we face. Dr. King reminds us by his life and his words, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. So don't you dare give up. Believe just as much when it's hard as you do when it's easy. The persistent beauty of our faith is our greatest legacy.
Yes.
So what are we doing with this dream? This dream did not begin with Martin Luther King. It is a dream given to the world by Christ himself. It is a dream that one day the wicked would cease from troubling and the weary would be at rest. It is a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted and every mountain shall be made low. It is a dream that carried Christ to Calvary. It is a dream that motivated him to die on an old rugged cross. It is a dream that was reinvigorated by his resurrection early one Sunday morning. It is this faith. It is this faith of our mothers and fathers that has kept our dreams alive. It is the faith of the sainted warriors of our past who have kept our hope alive. As each succeeding generation marches towards its destiny, it is important that each generation familiarize itself, remember, revisit, and update the dream of Dr. King and countless others who have lifted their voices to say, I have dreamed a dream. So, beloved, as the world this week inaugurates a new American president, and as the world celebrates the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., don't count yourself out.
Right.
You are part of his legacy, whether or not you share his ethnicity or race, because his legacy is one of justice, of passion, of service, and of faith. Though Dr. King's life was marked by hard times and discouragement and moments of defeat, it was ultimately a life full of grace. And that is a legacy that we should all aspire to keep. Amen.